Welcome to this year's Doc's Equinox program running online at Hamptons DocFest from April 22nd, which happens to be Earth Day, through Sunday, April 25th. You've just seen the vibrant Valerie Taylor and her brilliant underwater cinematography. Please stay tuned for a Q&A with Valerie and the award-winning director Sally Aitken, hosted and moderated by Giulia D'Agnolo Vallan, the artistic director of the Sag Harbor Cinema.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Giulia D'Agnolo Vallan, and I'm the director of the Sag Harbor, the artistic director of the Sag Harbor Cinema, and we are here for Doc's Equinox. So we are guests of the Hamptons Doc, our beloved festival. And with us from Sydney, Australia, is the great and only Valerie Taylor and Sally Aitken, the director of a documentary called Playing with Sharks, which we are showing both in cinema and virtually. Good evening, actually, good morning. It's 10 a.m. or so in Sydney. I like to start with a simple question. Give us a little bit of the context of the way this film was born. I believe that Bettina, your producer, had worked with Sally before.
We know each other through the industry here, but it was actually Valerie and Tina who had worked together 20 years ago?
Probably more. I don't know how old her daughters are, but they were little babies at the time. Probably 20 years ago, or maybe 24, 25. Yes.
And Tina had seen the Jane Goodall film and had sort of suddenly had an epiphany, realizing that, you know, here in Australia, Valerie equally was a pioneer in the marine space as opposed to the jungle, although you'd probably do that too if you had half a chance, and that there was an incredible film archive because of Ron and Valerie's work over the years. And so she, you know, reached out to me, and I had worked on a very archive-rich project about Australian cinema. We three met, we discussed it, and away we went. It's been an adventure ever since.
Valerie, you've been filmed most of your life, but this film is about you. It's your story. So it's a different kind of engagement. It's a different decision. Was it an easy decision to make, saying yes to it?
Oh, absolutely. I even said yes before I knew about it. I think my husband would be delighted to know that his lifetime of filming his wife had reached this stage of being internationally recognized. And no, I'm all for it. I think it's a wonderful thing. It's just that I wanted to direct it, I wanted to produce it, and I wanted it to be how I wanted it. And nobody let me. I had a director, I had a producer, I had everybody.
I know, so horrendous, wasn't it?
Oh, it was terrible.
Terrible.
Yes.
Sally, I think that the richness, the wealth of the film is this incredible archive that you had to work with, which is really Ron and part of Ron and Valerie's lifetime work. And also, I think you had access to Valerie's diaries since the late 1960s. Can you explain to us how did you work with these materials and how did you weave it into the contemporary footage?
Well, the diaries I read quite early on, and they gave me a wonderful insight. See, she's in demand. We're at Valerie's house and the phone rings off the hook. The diaries have been handwritten since 1969, and I was completely captivated because it's the voice as it's happening, not a retrospective examination of how the events played out. So they gave me, keep still because I disappear into the ocean. They gave me a real insight into the evolving Valerie, I suppose. And we did, in the early part of putting the film together, try and incorporate the diaries But the reality is we also have the advantage of the living, breathing, beautifully vibrant Valerie herself. So in fact, they became just a very interesting and useful background for me. The film footage was a constant process of examination and re-examination. And while the footage is all there, it was often shot for a different purpose. And so we did need to look around the margins, I suppose, and find candid moments, which probably wouldn't have been originally designed to be on screen, but little interactions between Ron and Valerie as they're preparing for a dive, or sort of sideline moments. They seemed to tell me more about both their partnership, but also obviously Valerie herself. But it's been a joy. The archive was a joy, but it's a great responsibility too, as you can imagine.
Oh, thank you.
Valerie, I mean, these days people make movies with a phone. You know, when you and Ron were diving and were filming, you had heavy equipment. I mean, it was a whole different story. You were real filmmaking pioneers. Can you bring us back to the rigs? You know, I mean, the heaviness, the cumbersomeness of this process. How much more difficult was that it would be today?
Well, Ron built an underwater housing for a Bolex in 1958. And that was the start. His dream was to be an underwater photographer. There were no housings for cameras to go underwater at that time. They were very rare. So he built his own. All his life, he's built his own cameras until he went into Technoscope, and he still built his cameras, housings. And it was a progress all the way up, getting bigger and better and more familiar with what we were trying to do. So it was an adventure. The whole time was adventure. Going out into the wilderness where no one had ever been diving before and finding a new reef. This is before satellites, and a lot of the coral sea wasn't charted. And diving off the boat, falling off the boat through the surface and seeing a world that no one else had ever seen. Absolutely magic. I've had the best life. Absolutely magic. And now, of course, all those reefs are on the map because of the satellite maps. But back then, it was exploration as well as adventure. Even the sharks and the fish, we had to get to know them before we could really work with them properly. And I discovered early in the piece that marine animals, all marine animals, seem to have their counterpart on land. That, like animals anywhere, there's the shy ones, the timid ones, the aggressive ones. And once you know all that, you can work with them. You know how to handle a sea snake, and you know how to handle a moray eel, and you know how to handle a shark. But that takes a long time to learn, a lot of experience.
Well, I would argue that you know how to handle those. Not very other people on Earth could. But I think that what you were just describing, and the fascination and this encounter with this world that was uncharted, is also what makes this documentary so special, because it's a document of the way the sea was and is no longer, for in a lot of places. And I mean, it must be bittersweet for you to see this difference.
It's sad, very sad. There are many places off Australia, the Great Barrier Reef, the Coral Sea, that have been fished out of the big fish, the sharks. Absolute destruction. The problem with marine animals, they're free for the taking. Nobody has to plough their field and plant the crop. They're just there, and you can take them, and you don't have to pay for them to grow up to be a big edible fish. Nowadays, when I go diving, I like to go up near the equator. The water is warmer. The sea life is richer. The corals are more colourful and richer. And so far, not many people live right up in those warmer waters. Unfortunately, I can't go right now because of the virus, but as soon as it's over, I'll be off.
Sally, you've used, well, describing Valerie, a wonderful definition, and I'd like to ask you to explain it, and for Valerie to say, if you see identify. You call Valerie an accidental conservationist. And I think it's really wonderful, and it's kind of woven into the spirit of the film, this sort of spontaneous conversion. Can you talk a little bit about it?
The idea that, you know, we have recently seen, for example, David Attenborough confess and remorse that while he was making natural history films, he had also seen a decline, and latterly has, you know, spoken very movingly about the need for that. In a funny kind of way, Valerie's traveled further because she started off as a hunter. And the idea that you can start from that place, albeit a champion in your own right, and certainly at a time when the word conservation wasn't even known, let alone the concept of it being adopted, that you can start from that place and through your own personal epiphanies radically transform is actually an inspiring journey that we can all make. So I think that that's the accidental part. You know, we are all equally capable of transformation. Don't ever think that you can't. But I don't know if you would cop to the to the definition of an accidental conservationist.
Well, a very great friend of ours, Sir Peter Scott, he founded the World Wildlife Fund. He started off as a hunter of wildfowl. Mm. And he said one day he looked at 3 or 4 beautiful dead ducks that he'd just shot. And he thought, I'm never doing this again. This is terrible. Exactly what my husband and I did after a spearfishing competition, the Australian Spearfishing Championships. We both won. I won the women's, he won the men's. We looked at what we'd done, and Ron said, I'm not doing this again. And I said, I don't want to either. And we walked away at the top of the trade. And it
was at the same time, right? It was kind of at the same time.
Peter was already with the World Wildlife Fund. He was running it with the royal family in Holland, I believe. And he'd already set up huge places like Slimbridge where the birds could come and be safe, which they did and still do. Seems that they're not stupid, these swans and ducks. They know where it's safe, or they wouldn't have been around anyway, I guess. But I've always thought, and Sir Peter said to me one day, he said, Valerie, most of the top conservationists in the world start off as hunters, because then you know what you're doing and you know what is happening and you know to stop.
And I think the only other thing to add there is we're obviously in a very different age. You know, most of us aren't going out on hunting expeditions. Mm-hmm. But I do think the thing that has been the experience of all of these people that Valerie has been mentioning, and certainly true for Ron and Valerie, is the personal realization of our interconnectedness. And I do think that that is universal. And one of the things that I so greatly admire is this idea of leaning in, if you will, or diving in. You know, we are in an age, I think, where we are recognizing that we humans are not the chief, and that actually all the animals, both, you know, in the ocean and on land and in the air, have an incredibly vital role. So biodiversity, habitat, all of this is part of the planet, and we are part of the planet. And so I think that while we might pat ourselves on the back that we're not going out and, you know, shooting rhino. We equally do have to recognize that we are just the same in so many ways, and that the quicker that we all come to that, the healthier our future will be, I think.
You've used the word interconnectedness, you know, and I think that one thing that one of the many things that I love about the film is how this comes spontaneously out of the movie, and by this really playful relationship that Valerie has with the fish, but with sharks in particular. Can you talk a little about this kind of whimsical? I mean, you know, it's interesting how the men talk about you in the document, you know, in the film. They're like, oh, you know, nobody would have gone close, and she was just right there. And it's just sort of engagement that is whimsical and playful and wise and very unique of your relationship with these creatures.
Well, as I said before, there's similar creatures on land, and some of them actually like to be handled. A couple of sharks, if you stroke them along the back of the head carefully, they love it. They sort of sit there. Or if you tickle their gills, they think you're a big cleaner rat and sit very still and open their gills. And you learn that through experience, through working with them, through watching them, through swimming with them. And I've been very, very fortunate. One, I've always liked animals on land or underwater. Two, I don't seem to have the incredible fear that many people have. I'm not afraid of drowning. I'm not afraid of being eaten by a shark. I'm quite positive I won't. And that gives you a certain amount of get up and go that maybe you wouldn't have. I don't hesitate. And I think that's one thing my husband appreciated. You know, if he said, jump off the boat to those sharks, I'd jump off the boat. I mean, why wouldn't I? And that's how I thought about it.
That's well, why wouldn't you? Of course, you're Valerie Taylor.
Oh, no, I'm working with my husband, and I want him to think I'm a good wife, a good buddy.
Well, you know, a part of the film that is very, very moving is the part, you know, the part where we learn you're involved in Jaws, you know, in creating, you know, this film that changed cinema history, you know, and then realizing that some of the unwanted effect was to increase, you know, fear and distrust, you know, in relationship with sharks. And that's, you know, that make a big change in your life. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Of course, that was so unexpected. Jaws is a fictitious story about a fictitious shark. As my husband always said on interviews, you don't go to New York and expect King Kong on the top of the Empire State Building. So why do you go in the water and expect Jaws to materialize out of crystal clear water and start thrashing around amongst the swimmers? We thought it was a good story. Richard Zanuck, he sent us the galley proofs of a book called Jaws and asked us if we would think of making a film about it. Was it a good idea? And we both said yes, of course, because it worked for us. And that's how it all started. So they acquired the copyright to the book to make a film. And David Brown, he actually came out at one stage to talk to us. And they were very smart. They didn't start filming anything above water till we had shot all the underwater. And I'm often given the credit for shooting the underwater on Jaws. My husband shot it. I think there's one single scene in there that I shot, and that's it. There was a second camera on the deck at all times. But
you were filming, right? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I knew how to use it. And if I saw something from above water, I was in charge of the baits. I would pick up the camera and start filming. And that was very handy with the shark breaking the winch off the side of the boat. That worked exactly perfectly well. But that's not. My husband was the main cameraman. He was the top. Universal were delighted. Ron went to Hollywood to help them design and build a great white shark, because our white sharks are about 12 to 14 feet in length, and the one in Jaws was 24 feet in length. So everything had to be half-sized. And that created a bit of a problem, especially when our little stuntman refused to go in the cage anymore. And I had to crouch down in it, and Ron had to get in it too and shoot over my shoulder just to get some over-the-shoulder shots. But it was just a job to us at the time. The fact that it did so well not only surprised us, but it also surprised everybody else involved. I'll say this for Universal, they were very generous to us. They didn't go into production until we had got the sort of underwater footage they wanted. And then they flew us to Martha's Vineyard so we could see what they were doing there and watch them doing all the above water. And that was great. And we got to meet the people involved. And we were very fortunate there. The sad thing is that the general public tended to take the film seriously. It seems like men in particular, what a monster they can go out and kill. And the slaughter of all sharks, not even just dangerous ones, any shark. They thought they were heroes. I stood on the beach in Sydney, down at Port Lincoln actually, and saw the men coming in, dragging their sharks out of the boats. All heroes, my hero. Oh, very sad. And Universal took us to New York, and then they sent us on a trip all around America. We did every live talk show telling the public not to be afraid of sharks. And I appreciate that. Sadly, they're still afraid of sharks. There's even Jaws clubs. Can you imagine that? Jaws clubs.
They're very, very, very big fans of Valerie. I think that the other thing that was interesting, though, is it did seem that you doubled down, if you like, on your efforts because you knew the shark.
Yes.
And part of it was ignorance in some ways.
Yeah, I guess it was ignorance, and they believed what they saw in the movie, which is sort of similar to a news story that comes on the news that is highly exaggerated to the point of almost being ridiculous, and people believe it. It's sad in a way because a lot of information that goes out, especially about wild animals, especially about sharks, it's not necessary. It's not exactly correct or true.
Valerie, there is a scene in the film where you're not allowed, it's the first time Ron filmed ever, the first great white. It was
Yes.
filmed by Ron. And you were not allowed on the boat because you were a woman. And I can imagine how mad you were. And I want to ask Sally to this because Valerie is wonderfully, a matter of fact, she's like, oh yeah, that was no problem. But Sally, how unique was Valerie in what she was doing at the time, both in terms of a diver, of a photographer, artist, and then, a hunter, and then a conservationist. And I mean, how pioneering in a world that was really not welcoming to women.
Utterly unique, I think, is the answer. It's also perhaps indicative of Valerie's enormous appetite to do everything. And, what isn't in the film is that she was also a go-go dancer, a stage actress, a stunt woman, a model, But certainly the ocean, I think, from your teenage years was a great passion. And yes, the idea that the world wasn't welcoming to women, I think from speaking with Valerie and our own awareness of growing up in the culture, I think, one of the things, though, is that there is a slight freedom because it isn't expected and therefore it isn't stamped out. So it's an interesting double edge there, but certainly, statistically, no, the idea of spearfishing was massively popular in Australia. The clubs were right up and down the coastline, as I think that was true in New Zealand and certainly around America. You know, spearfishing was a major sport in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and in places still is. And it was massively male dominated. That's absolutely true. The fact that, you know, Valerie was such a champion, I think, is also down to her own athleticism and sheer bloody mindedness, actually. And then, but the photography, she's an artist, a painter and an illustrator. So photography, you know, the idea of composition, the idea of beauty is something that you said that your mother, as a child, you would walk along the beach and she would point out the different shells.
Yes.
And I think, you know, these things that we have in our childhood about noticing perhaps was something, but also that was then combined with Ron's technical skills. And what, again, isn't in the film, but is in fact the first cover that you had for National Geographic is Valerie as a photographer through the 70s and 80s, the preeminent underwater photographer, female photographer in the world. And she pioneered macro photography. Ron made a very special unit which automatically worked out the focal distance. And so they were able to photograph extraordinary images of tiny creatures and incredible corals and amazing detail, and that was utterly groundbreaking. And then that technology was picked up and developed further. But yeah, so she's a true pioneer, but not only in her unique relationship with sharks.
Valerie, we're almost running out of time, but what does going into the water still give you these days? I mean, you just said that, you know, I can't go now because of the virus, but, you know, as soon as I can, I'm just going to go back to the equator and just go inside. What gives you, what is still the water?
When you roll out of the tinny, well, that's a small tin boat, and you break the surface, you go into an alien environment and you have no idea what's there. Every dive gives you something different. It's a moving environment. The fish come and go. It's like a forest. The corals stay there and the animals move around. So every dive, you are waiting for something big, something exciting, something new. So in a way, everyone's an adventure. And I've done thousands and thousands of dives. And unless we've been working on a film with underwater actors, it has been an adventure every dive. You don't know, you can't tell what you're going to find until you go there. On land, you can see around, say, oh, this is nice, yes. Oh, there's a deer, there's a possum. Under the water, you can't do that until you drop through the surface. And there's one other thing. You can fly. You're weightless. There's no gravity. You can look across to corals in the distance and fly over to them. Now that's important with me because I'm old and I have arthritis and I can't hardly walk over to things on land, but underwater I can still fly.
Well, I am speechless. I can't imagine a better, you know, way to end our conversation. And I am so happy we're able to bring this film to Sag Harbor and to the viewers of Hamptons Docs virtually. Thank you both and congratulations for a fantastic collaboration.
Oh, thank you. Very intelligent questions, I must say. Good ones. Yeah.
I'm glad.
Your approval mattered. Thank you so much for including us. We're absolutely thrilled and hope the viewers enjoy the film.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.